Today's going to be pretty simple. We're just going to look at some subscriber submitted videos that I posted on Instagram for anyone that wanted to submit videos for form critique. And we had some great options to look through. Some that are maybe a little bit more obvious, but I really like some of these as examples because some are not very obvious. They're very, very, very minor things that can make a big difference. So we're going to be able to really break this down and see the little minute details that can make a big difference in kind of bringing everything together with those small little form errors that can kind of hold people back. So without further ado, let's get right into it. First one we have here is BJ Chan. So we can look here, let's give a little shout out. BJ Chan on Instagram. We've got his squat video. So let's go through all three of these in full speed and then we'll start breaking them down. So here we go is his squat from a side view. All right, we got one more rep here. And final one. Okay, second video, we've got a front view. A little harder to see kind of what's going on here, but there's one thing I will come back around kind of show here. One more rep. Okay, good. And our rear view video. Final rep. Okay, so let's go through each one of these and kind of point out what I see and what we can work on. So if there was a primary thing for what I see is mainly from the side view, and we see it a lot more on that second rep. We see it a little bit on the first rep. So I'm ignoring kind of the setup there. We're gonna come back to that in a little bit. But if we're looking here, if we notice his initial movement mainly comes from his hips. His knees are breaking, but notice his shin angle isn't changing. His knees are only breaking to allow this hinge pattern to occur. So he's starting by biasing back, and then his knees start breaking. And you can see here, we have straight bar path, and even though it's not direct side angle, you can see here, as we get about to right here, he shifts forward. And that's because of this compensation at the beginning of starting back and having to adjust as we come down to get back into those quads to come back up. And you're gonna see then the hips shoot coming back up. Now the second rep, that happens even to a greater extent, and we can see the fault that happens that comes from that. So again, a little bit even more of hips back, hips back, hips back, hips back, then the knees finally start. And we really see here, he gets forward, and then that leads him into this chest fall pattern because his hips shoot back because since he is too forward and forward of his midfoot, a couple things happen. One, if you're forward of the midfoot, you're putting extra pressure or extent of the tension and work on the quadriceps and the adductors. And if they're not strong enough, you're going to have to shoot your hips back to get the posterior chain back in the movement. But usually what's happening is you will overdo it. Like it's this constant rock back and forth when you do this. As the body's not good at kind of just getting back to neutral, it tends to overcompensate each way. So he does that, he loses it forward and the chest falls because two, if you're in front of the midfoot, it's now placing a greater strain on that lower back because there is more of that bar in front of the midfoot in your center of gravity. So there is a higher degree of strain and work that needs to be done for the lower back to maintain its position. So we're going to lose that position a bit. And you can see here, this is a very common fault. You push forward, the hips shoot back, and then about halfway up, you then have to drive the knees back forward. You see the knees driving back forward to then get back onto the quads to finish the movement. So the biggest thing here is that I'm gonna say we need to lead with the knees a bit more. So the initial break needs to be started with the knees, not with the hips. I would say drive the knees forward, let the chest lean, and almost kind of think about, like, I like to think about, here's your tailbone. Your tailbone should drop straight down below your heels. You can see here, the tailbone immediately changes its angle and comes back here, and then has to compensate at the bottom to then going back behind the heels. So you saw that there's this pattern here of that tailbone and SI joint, or sacrum, shifting positions throughout the movement instead of just having this pattern of dropping down as the knees drive forward and the chest leans. So really emphasizing more knee drive, staying over that midfoot while you do that, allowing that chest to lean to create the hinge pattern and letting that tailbone drop straight down. So from the front view, the main thing I see here is not during the squat, it's during the setup. So we can see here, he braces, and then adjusts his elbows. And we can see there, once you brace, that should be locking in every part of the setup you've decided to implement. And what I mean by that is whatever your elbow position is, whatever your oblique position is, whatever your knee angle, your hip, every aspect of your setup should be in place. Then you brace to lock it in, because bracing is taking all that tension and trying to integrate it together. So we don't want to create some type of change in position after we brace. So he braces, then shifts his elbows down, draws his ribs cage up, and slightly extends there. So I'm not against trying to kind of pull those elbows down and get a bit tighter there, but that needs to be before you brace, because we need to allow that brace to then help to stabilize that rib cage with the obliques to the pelvis. So set the elbows, then brace, then squat, because that brace is setting all those things in line to make sure then we can maintain that throughout the squat. And then lastly here, there's not too much I see from this rear view. Fact of the matter is, so I see a couple things like I could nitpick, but the fact of the matter is this could be very much his biomechanical genetics that's creating this. So we can see a slightly more angled out right foot, but again, I don't see any issue with that, because that seems to be exactly where everything leads to. That's not necessarily an issue for everyone. So, and as he goes down, the knees are tracking with the feet. I don't see really any bias or shift too much anyway. The only slight thing is we see a little bit of a disparity with kind of where his midline is. And that's, I don't know, this is where it's hard for me just from video to diagnose this, but I don't know if there might be just some slight scoliosis, and that's just kind of the line of his back. But if we're looking at his spine here, it's not following from his head down to the sacrum, is not in a straight line. My guess, if this isn't some just genetic predisposition where he has a slightly rounded back laterally, which is very, very common, we do see some adjustments or changes here when it comes to shoulder position. You can see it in kind of all three videos that he has a slightly higher right elbow throughout the movement. And we can see some changes even with grip patterns here. I don't even know if he lacks shoulder mobility here, because I think maybe he's making up for it here by having a slightly more extended wrist that allows his elbow to get down. But either way, I would implement some type of shoulder mobility drills. And BJ, you can feel free to message me and I'll send you those directly. I have a post on Instagram as well with a couple of those. So for anyone watching this video, I will link my main post that has 2 of my main shoulder mobility drills that I have most people work on. But I would just be diligent in making sure to do something before squat to kind of get this loosened up. Because as power lifters, we have one thing that we do a lot that tends to hamper shoulder mobility, and that's benching. Because benching, the pectoral internally rotates the shoulder. So if we're constantly benching and creating these big pecs that are very tight, it constantly is wanting to internally rotate our shoulder. And then we go low bar squat, and then we need more external rotation. So it's this constant battle back and forth of what we want. So if we're not taking care of that and kind of helping to kind of get ourselves in position before we even get under the bar, sometimes we can kind of lead in these patterns of discrepancies from side to side with where our elbows are. And then if our elbows are different, are changing, it's going to change the lat tightness, which then changes the oblique, which then changes how it's going to be relative with the tension to the pelvis. And it just goes all the way down the chain. So while I don't see some major issue here, because for the most part, everything looks fairly good from this view. I would probably implement some type of shoulder mobility stuff, because that's probably going to, in the long run, kind of help you to be able to just maintain more neutrality and kind of help even this out a tiny bit. All right, next up we got CJ Baroy, Colin Baroy, hopefully I'm saying that right, but here's his Instagram handle for a quick little shout out. And we've got his bench video, and I really like this one because it's a great example of something that looks like it's a phenomenal bench press, but we have a slight little detail that's probably holding him back a little bit. It's probably holding him back a little bit when it comes to kind of efficiency of movement, and probably even more so, kind of this issue I see tends to lead to pec minor issues because of this bias and distribution of tension side to side. So let's take a look at both of his videos here. Here's from the side view. From the side view, it looks really solid. I'm going to come back around to this. There's just one slightly little minor thing I see here, but for the most part, really good setup. Great job at using the legs to create elevation at the rib cage, and good bar path. Good. All right, then from this more front view, let's take a look at this with a couple reps he does. One more rep. Okay. So first, let's look at the side. So like I said, for the most part, this is phenomenal. Does a great job of it using those legs to extend and elevate that rib cage up. He's on those upper traps. You can see the skin of his neck driving that bench. That looks phenomenal. And even better, even after he unracks, he does a great job. I'm not a big fan of cueing, retracting to press the shoulders. More so, if you're using those legs correctly to drive and elevate that rib cage up to the bar, you're going to see here, it just kind of happens. You can see here, oh, right there. He does a little bit more leg drive, and that right there is then changing his shoulder orientation to his torso. That created the retraction and depression he needed without ever having to cue it. So great job there. Then we get throughout the movement, looks really good. Second rep is my favorite one. We can see here, really efficient, good touch point, presses back up. The third rep probably is a slight little misgroove, and this is a very common thing we see with high arch benchers because of how this creates probably a more vertical bar path compared to a more flat back benching. We can see here, he comes down good, but then he kind of dumps it and loses it forward a little bit. So there's a little bit too much of a low touch point there. So I just really cue just letting those elbows drop straight to the floor to create that more vertical bar path and keep maintaining that higher touch point to not allow that bar to kind of get away from you, and have to have this more vertical path coming out, which places a lot more stress on those anterior deltoids. So for the most part though, that looks really good from the side. It's more from this view that we're seeing the slight little dysfunction. So we can see here, we see this asymmetry in the bar. We see this lean and tilt to the right side, which then is placing more weight distribution on the right side, which is where I said that people tend to, and I have seen fairly often, this eventually leads to some type of pec minor issue from this change in distribution side to side. Right elbow bent. And while he does start to correct that as he descends a little bit, it still is maintained throughout most of the movement. We can, right there, it's not too bad, but then he goes and kind of resets. Right side biases down, and so forth. So the big mistake people make on this particular issue is they think there must be something wrong with this right side, or maybe I'm not retracting and depressing my left side enough, which is incorrect. It is all coming from the feet right here, which is not very obvious at first, but we'll kind of show you kind of what's happening here. So the fact of the matter is everyone's hips are different and they're asymmetrical. Your left hip versus your right hip is not the same. And if you look at your bench, you'd be hard to find someone who has perfectly symmetrical feet placement. Some are really bad, and that's what really creates kind of this offset on the bench. You can actually see here, he's kind of biased towards his left here. He's not fully centered on the bench, he's towards the left, which is actually really, really common. And I'll be honest, I don't always correct that part of it, because the fact of the matter is that's just kind of normal. If it's excessive, we need to correct it. But having a slightly different foot position isn't the worst. It's probably going to happen. It's more of what we're doing with the feet. So just to kind of point out here that you can see here, right foot's angled out a little bit more. He's slightly more abducted, less abducted on this side here, which is kind of then pushing him towards his left side. So the biggest issue we have here is what that does going up the chain. So you can see here, extended a bit more with that right knee, or left knee, right knee is a bit more bent. And what this eventually creates is right here, we see it. His left rib cage is floating higher than his right. So I'm gonna argue this right side is actually doing what it's supposed to. Now, on a high arch bench, obviously we are not clamping down on our obliques and bracing super hard, or else that's gonna draw the rib cage down. We're actually allowing those obliques to really lengthen and allow expansion so that rib cage can elevate, but that doesn't mean we don't still have control with the obliques. We don't wanna lose the obliques, and what I call what's happening here is I call it a floating rib cage. That has lost connection with the obliques is doing nothing, and that rib cage is floating up. So what we're having here is from that right leg through that oblique, through that shoulder, we're creating almost kind of this excessive tension compared to this left side. Like I guarantee if we looked from straight above, we would actually see, pretend like this is his head here and this is his torso. We would probably see his torso having this slight curve. And not because he's built like that, but because since he's clamping down here and he's not over here, it's pushing everything over to this left side, which is why he's biased over to this left side and not even on the bench. So how do we fix that? So what's happening is because since he's on this left oblique or this right oblique, and he's probably most likely more on this right leg, it's creating more shoulder retraction and depression here, which is bending his elbow. I guarantee if you ask him to straighten his elbow, he'll tell you it's actually really hard to do. Where this left side looks like it's less depressed and less retracted. We're not gonna try and over retract this side though. That's just gonna lead to more issues. What we really need is we need to find context with this left oblique and find better context with this left foot. So what I mean by that is we don't need to clamp down on this left oblique, but we need to make sure it's doing something. Like it needs to help control this rib cage position so we don't float, because you can see throughout the entire movement, that left rib cage is higher than the right one. And where that usually leads from is from foot pressure. It's not going to be highly noticeable, but most likely he's driving a bit more and putting a bit more pressure with this right foot, which is creating this irradiation and tension effect that makes that left oblique start to activate and clamp down a little bit more. Where the left leg is probably, he's a little lighter on that left foot, which doesn't create as much of an irradiation, allows that oblique to lengthen and kind of not be turned on, allows that left rib cage to float up. So the two things I'm gonna have Colin do is, one, find context with that left oblique to make sure that that's kind of, so that we have some type of feeling that that's helping to control that rib cage and not allowing it to free float. And then second, be very mindful to feel that left foot into the floor. If you're feeling that left foot into the floor and you're feeling pressure driving through that heel and through the toes into the floor, you're most likely going to feel more tension and irradiation coming up and then helping to activate and let that oblique control that rib cage a bit better. So a way you can kind of really feel that and feel the discrepancy side to side when someone has an issue like that is doing some single arm dumbbell bench pressing. So with your feet and everything like this, just do single arm dumbbell bench pressing. A certain amount of reps on one side, certain amount of reps on the other, and what you're gonna feel is like if he's on his left hand and single arm dumbbell bench pressing, he's gonna really have to drive through that left foot to not fall over onto that left side. And that's you're gonna notice that creates more tension on that left oblique. But when you do that single arm, it then causes you to bias from this side, from the opposite side. So usually what I'll do is I'll have someone reach with an empty hand and really make sure to hold onto this opposite side oblique as they're benching single arm with the other side. Where he's probably gonna actually find the most benefit is single arm benching on his right side, driving with his left foot, but then having to maintain context with his left oblique so he doesn't fall over to the right side. So just to kind of summarize that, biggest things here is find context with that left oblique to draw that rib cage, not really draw the rib cage down, but make sure that rib cage doesn't start free floating, and then really make sure you're feeling pressure with that left foot to create that irradiation effect going up to that oblique to help kind of provide it with a bit more activation to help hold strong with it to help control that rib cage. All right, next up we got Kansas David Potter, a little shout out for Instagram, with his squat. So let's take a look at both these, the side and the front view, and get into it. All right, there we go from the side. Then let's look at the front. I'll kind of fast forward that setup a little bit since we saw the full setup already. Okay, so let's take a look at both. I see there's something on a little bit on each of these views that we can work on. So first and foremost starts with that setup. If you've watched my low bar setup video, I'm very big on keeping that head up as you set up. And he does it at first. And if you look when he's doing that, look at the elbow position in relation to the rest of his body. Now, he's having to flare that rib cage a bit to do that, but that's, in my opinion, that's okay. At this point, that is okay. This is not the time we're trying to really perfectly set our pelvis and our obliques. We're trying to set our upper back at this point. So I like what he's doing here. But then notice as he looks down, his elbows disproportionately start coming up. So the number one thing from the get-go, look up, look straight forward as you're setting your upper back so you can get as good of a shelf and upper back tightness as possible. Once you walk it out, then you can set the obliques, which kind of fight the upper back. The upper back is trying to extend. Our obliques are trying to flex. They're trying to kind of fight against each other. And we want that. We don't want one of them to win. We want both of them to battle each other and just create this neutral position. And he's in a decently neutral position to an extent, but we can see a little bit his rib cage is decently flared down. His elbows are up, which is then going to have to be compensated by extension once we get into the movement. So the next thing is, I kind of mentioned this on BJ Chan's video, is he braces with his head down, then pulls his head up. Make sure, however you decide where you look, whatever you're gonna do, that is set and then brace, because we can see as soon as he looks up, it then is going to change things. So we go to squat, we go down, we see a little bit of, not bad, but a little bit of extension there. The single biggest issue I see with Dave though, is that he leads so much with the knees. So here, if you look at that torso, pretty much he has a slight little lean at first, but for the most part, the knees win. They've gone, if you look, this is as far as they're gonna go forward, and he's not even all the way down. So as he goes down, he actually starts to shift back because his knees reach their end range of flexion too soon. He does a good job of not losing position and going too far onto his toes, because some people will keep driving those knees forward. They'll go onto their toes and they'll lose it forward. He just eventually has to shift back. So we can see here, one of the things he does though, that's kind of helping those knees to get to their end range sooner, is we have soft knees. Anytime we have soft hips or soft knees, especially soft knees, that's going to give that joint an advantage in finding its end range of motion. Like now there's less distance that knee has to flex because you already have it slightly flexed. So I'm not saying hyperextend the knees, but within powerlifting, it is a rule that the knees need to start locked. Doesn't mean hyperextended, but have them directly under you so there's that soft knee position, because that's also going to help you not allow the knees to win so much. Like it's going to require more room for those knees to then have to move, so they're not going to drive forward as soon. The second thing is, I'm really going to cue that, continue with that knee drive, but make sure that that chest is leaning the entire time too. That chest needs to lean, and you can see here it doesn't. You just kind of shift forward with the knees, the chest continues to face forward. It doesn't lean and allow those hips to hinge as the knees break. So I don't want to tell you not to drive the knees forward. We need to do that, but I would start with softer knees, and I would make sure to really cue that chest needs to lean from the get-go and maintain continuing to lean throughout the movement. Don't just make up for it at the bottom there. So with that, Dave said probably his biggest issue when he messaged me is kind of his shift, and we can definitely see that here. So I'm going to kind of go fast, but we can see you can see very obvious shift to the right, and he's actually turned. Like this is, I'm not even going to call this necessarily a shift per se. It's more of a rotation, because a shift is usually more of some type of discrepancy in internal rotation side to side. We tend to shift away from the side that has less internal rotation and then bias towards the side that has more external rotation. That's not Dave's issue because he actually evens out at the bottom and is completely fine. Like right here, you're pretty good. It's more of a bias up top. Something up top is wrong when you first start, because even right here, you're actually already rotated to where your chest is rotated towards your left. So the first thing I'm gonna look at here is what possibly, whether it's your feet, whether it's the knees, whether it's the shoulders, what possibly is rotated from the get-go that could be causing the rest of you to rotate. And if we look, his right elbow is higher. I'm not going to say that's causing it 100%, but what I'm going to say is that we see a discrepancy here versus his right shoulder mobility versus his left. I assume shoulder mobility is an issue for the fact that he's doing the 3-finger grip and putting that pinky under. So that's probably something he's already kind of understood, that in some manner his shoulder mobility is lacking, because that's why he's compensating by doing this 3-finger grip. So very possible having that right shoulder elevated and this elbow pulling down more and that lat pulling is then helping to rotate him towards that side. Because if right now you let your right elbow raise up and you pull in with your left elbow, you'll notice you'll start pulling towards that left side. So my initial reaction is because he's able to create more tightness with that left lat, he's pulling into that, which then rotates his hips to the right. The second thing is this, even though if he doesn't realize this, whether he realizes it or not, there is more pressure currently on his right foot. He is biased away from foot pressure on his left. So the two things I'm going to initially really want Dave to do here is, first, we need to work on shoulder mobility. We need to get that right elbow in a better position. So again, I'm going to link that shoulder mobility drill post I have at the bottom to kind of hammer those drills. And then second, I possibly would play with grip width here a little bit. He actually has a fairly narrow grip in relation to a lot of lifters. And so if he's really struggling with mobility, the first thing I'm going to do is have him just maybe a finger or two out wider, not putting his hands out here all of a sudden, because we're going to lose a lot of our ability to get our upper back tight, but maybe just one finger out. Just give yourself a little more room for that shoulder to be able to move around, and you're probably just from that is going to see an improvement in shoulder mobility, and then adding in the drills is going to kind of help to kind of reinforce that. As well as adding in what I mentioned with the upper back tightness from the get-go and really kind of helping to get those shoulders retracted and depressed in a better position, which is going to help to allow for more external rotation at the shoulder. So, but let's get that right shoulder down, possibly widen out that grip by one finger, and then from there, really focusing on making sure to feel even foot pressure. And I would possibly go barefoot for a little while to really feel that, because if you're barefoot, you're going to feel it. The shoes will add some type of sensory block. Like you're not going to feel your foot as much the more material there is between your foot and the floor. So there's this sensory block of what's occurring at the feet. So if you go barefoot, most likely you're going to feel more dramatically what's happening with that right foot having more pressure and the left foot not having as much. And then the third thing I'm going to do is just be very mindful of where your chest is pointing from the get-go. This is partially probably just a bad habit. While I mentioned these other things, I would almost lead this more to being just a general bad habit of developing this need for rotation. So I'd be very mindful of just having your chest pointed straight forward and trying to maintain that. And if you do that, you're probably going to start to notice a difference in tension distribution. You're probably going to feel more now in your left glute. You're going to feel more now in your left foot. More pressure, and just be very mindful of that pressure. Kind of with lighter weights, start memorizing what that feels like so you can mimic that feeling as you get to heavier weights. All right, so for our final video of the day, we've got Alex here, Instagram Alex_Kubi, Alejandro. So let's take a look at both of these. Here's kind of the semi-side view we've got for his squat. And then the rear view. Okay, so let's break this down. So from the side, we don't see as much. It really is kind of everything I'm going to kind of talk about from the side is going to be mainly what I see from the rear view, knowing that we need to fix that from the side view. So we see here, he does a really good job of maintaining pretty good neutrality throughout the spine. That tailbone drops straight down, his knees drive forward, and at the bottom you can see he kind of has to shift back, but that's going to go back to what we're going to talk about here. And then coming up, maintains that as well. So I think the only thing I would say for him from this view, and it's going to kind of lead to the back view, when you are setting up, this is something I've said for the other two videos as well, you start with this really head down position. You don't actually stay there. You eventually look up, and I like that angle of where you're looking, and that looks like a decent spot. But when you're getting set up from the get-go, keep that head up, because you can see here, you drop your head as you unrack, those shoulders shrug, the upper back rounds, and you're actually in kind of a flexed over depressed state with that upper back. And you can even see here from that side view, you start kind of with this depressed rib cage, and then when you squat, you pull those elbows down. It then pulls you into good position at this point. If you could just start there in the first place, that would be much better. You're having to compensate to get that rib cage in a better position about halfway down. So start with that head looking up a little bit more. Maintain that as you walk out. Try not to look straight down at your feet, which is then pulling those elbows up and dropping that chest. Then, as you go to brace, try to think about pulling those elbows down as you inhale so that you can't allow those shoulders to shrug and elevate. Because anytime you do that, you're disassociating that rib cage from the obliques and the pelvis. It's separating the two. We don't ever want to elevate this position. So actively think about pulling those elbows down as you breathe and brace, and that's going to help to kind of direct the air and that intra-abdominal pressure into the right spot. Again, if you go watch my low bar setup video, a lot of this is covered there with that initial setup and kind of what I'm trying to lead to with how we're trying to create the best brace and the best walkout and the best unrack. So from there though, the single biggest thing we're having issues with is this stance width. Now, while a wide stance could be right for someone, I can see here that there's a lot of factors that are telling me that's not where you want to go. One, we can see how over supinated and rolled over you are with your feet. Literally, your shoe has started to reform because of that. We're way too far on that outside of the foot, which means as you're going down, you're excessively biasing into those glutes and those abductors, and you can't maintain that. As soon as you go to come up, this isn't a matter of like an issue of knee valgus. This is a matter of that your adductors are the primary mover of hip extension out of the bottom position, and they're having to do their job. And you see your foot roll back, you see those femurs internally rotate, and then when you come back up, literally right at the point where it switches from adductors being the primary mover to the glutes being the primary mover, you see those knees drive back out and get in position. So the single biggest thing I'm going to say for you, Alex, is we need to bring that stance width in. And it kind of, in a sense, tells you where your stance needs to be, because for the most part, our femurs are going to go where they want to go to be the strongest. And if they're going to right there, that tells me if I was your coach, I would have your foot there and I would have your foot there. I would bring them in to where those femurs are wanting to bias to be the strongest when it comes to that bottom position, which is the hardest position of the squat since we're the most flexed and we're the most elongated with most of our musculature. Bring those feet there so that we're able to stack that tibia and that foot more directly under the knee, so that we're not biasing towards internal rotation and then you have to go back out to external rotation. We more can just stack those joints from the get-go and create the most powerful position to drive force into the floor. That's also going to help you in regards to here. So at this point here, because you are so wide, it's very hard for most people. I mean, you are hitting depth, but you couldn't go much lower than that probably, because you're not going to have enough internal rotation to allow that, because you've maxed it out, or external rotation. And so that's kind of making you bias back towards the hips, and you really can't drive those knees much more forward because of that position. So you do a good job of, like I said, the knees drive forward. You do a good job allowing that chest to lean. but we just need to bring that stance within to better match what your musculature is wanting to do, to be able to better stack those feet under, and to get away from that foot wanting to over supinate. So with that, have your feet under you, and then make sure don't lose that big toe. So this goes back to one of my other videos, is watching the comprehensive guide to foot rooting. If you're watching that one, you'll learn kind of how I'm going to help you root the foot, so you can have context with the outside of the foot, but you don't lose that inside heel and the big toe as well, which is what you're doing there. So make sure you are feeling that big toe from the get-go, so you're not rolling on the outside of the heel as you are going down and then coming back up, and having that constant movement back and forth with pronation and supination with the foot, and not maintaining that stability there. So hopefully you got something out of those for yourself, on kind of learning and possibly seeing some mistakes that maybe you have within your own movement with the squat or the bench press, and how that could possibly, taking these 4 examples and applying it to your movement as well. If you feel like you got something out of this, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, share it, support it. I do this to be able to get out as much information as I can to help the general public with being able to be as knowledgeable and have as much success within the sport of powerlifting as possible.